you have a couple of years on me. In '68, I was still in junior high. Um,
You know how to hurt a guy.
yeah, I do.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center and a Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined, as I usually am, by Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair of Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Eliot, how are you on this fine spring day?
I'm doing very well. We've moved houses. Those of you who are watching us on YouTube will notice that I've got a different background. It's part of my collection of the collected works of Winston Churchill, including every last volume of the documents in the official biography. And it's a nice feeling to know that Winston Churchill has your back, you know.
Oh, there you go. You're going to do very well on Room Raider, I think. Lot to talk about. We've actually hit the century mark here at Shield of the Republic. We've just gone past 100 episodes since we started doing this in September of 2021, just after the really catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan. So looking back, what strikes you about the period we've been through?
Well, first, I'm struck by the fact that you can have 100 episodes of almost unrelieved complaints by grumpy old men about the conduct of American foreign policy, and you still have plenty of people tuning in. It's amazing. I think for me, it's disheartening, and even more disheartening than I expected. I think the Biden administration actually has done quite a good job so far on managing relations with China, and I'm in favor of the assertiveness with which they've approached China. I think I'm even in favor of a lot of the industrial policy. I mean, I'm less of a free trade purist than I used to be, that's for sure. There was the kind of the botched Afghanistan situation. They did a good opening job with Ukraine, but as you and I have many times discussed, I think they've botched the support of Ukraine in terms of the speed, the scale, the sense of urgency about arming Ukraine, about being, they're what I can only describe as timidity in the face of Russian threats. And then on Israel Gaza again, I think they have this tendency to start reasonably strong and then fluff it. And I think you see it there in the Israel Gaza war as well. One of the things I think I'm reflecting more and more on is, obviously, I mean, you and I think we're both deeply relieved that Joe Biden, with all of his faults, is our president. But I think one of the things that's really struck me over the last few years is what happens when you have a president who's simply not rhetorically competent. And, whether it's explaining to Americans, this is why the Ukraine war matters to us, or explaining to people, look, this is what, in the case of Israel and Gaza, this is what a war in an urban environment looks like, or explaining more generally to people, we're in a dangerous world, and these are the things we need to do. As you and I noted, I think last time, we haven't increased the defense budget. I mean, we haven't. There's this sort of talk around the periphery about what kind of world we're in. So the fact that you have somebody who just can't do it, or doesn't, I don't know whether lacks the facility or just doesn't believe it's important, or doesn't understand it. I think it's very troubling, and I think it's almost crippling. And the thing I find deeply disheartening is the alternative would be worse.
Yeah, of course. I want to be a little fair for a moment. and then I'll return to my normal
It
unfairness.
won't last.
Yeah. But, I think it's harder for any president today to command the bully pulpit than it was, say, for instance, when Richard Neustadt wrote Presidential Power, some 60 odd years ago, and talked about the bully pulpit being one of the important powers of the unenumerated powers of the president. And I think it's because of the sort of media, fragmentation. Um, we start each show with my advert, and the title of our show, of course, is a reference to Walter Lippmann. And when you think about the role Walter Lippmann played in national security, both as a participant when he worked for Woodrow Wilson, but then later as a commentator and a very respected columnist with his column Today and Tomorrow. There really isn't anything like that today.
Yeah.
It's harder for a president to communicate when he's not operating in a kind of 3-network world, but rather when you got 150 channels for people to choose from, and people are getting their information, from random, stray tweets on Twitter.
Yeah, but that's not an excuse not to try.
I agree with that, and I'm a little mystified about Biden because I think he's capable of doing this, kind of on occasion. I mean, I think the speech he gave in Israel, for instance, was extremely effective. The address he gave in the Oval when he came back from Israel was actually okay. I mean, my wish is that he had done something on Ukraine earlier that kind of did that. I mean, he kind of dealt with Ukraine kind of in passing, and then again in the State of the Union. But
although I wonder if there's a kind of deeper, I don't know, the pathology is too strong a word. It strikes me as a phenomenon among contemporary politicians. I don't think we've had since Ronald Reagan a really forceful and eloquent communicator who can articulate a vision. Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were fluent. That would be the way I would put it. There's no, for all that people celebrated Obama's eloquence, there's no phrase that sticks. There's no, and Clinton could talk your ear off, and he could do it very intelligently, but it was not articulating a vision the way Reagan did, or FDR, or Kennedy, or any of a number of people. I mean, even Eisenhower. Eisenhower gets short shrift. Actually, if you look at some of his speeches, they're quite impressive. But George H.W. Bush, not so much. Even George W. Bush could rise to the occasion. He gave a number of very good speeches, actually. But I just don't think that, for whatever reason, leading politicians think this is at the core of their job. Somebody who's much reviled these days, and he earned some of it. Boris Johnson, he could actually deliver a very good speech when the time came, and could say the right things at the right time. It just his other character flaws, I think, got in his way. But it's just been one. I think it's a dearth that unfortunately spreads across the Western world.
Yeah, I mean, there does seem to be a sort of absence of leadership, not just here but elsewhere as well. I'm not quite sure what explains it, but there have been other historical periods where you had weak leadership. The interwar years come to mind, for instance.
So, what are your thoughts about the century milestone of Shield of the Republic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm struck by the degree to which we have been focused, as we should be, on the largest war in Europe since World War II. That's taken up a lot of our time, of course, since October 7th, very focused on the Middle East. Although I will say, we had Isabel Kirchner talking about Israel even before October 7th. So, we've, I think, had some opportunity to talk about a variety of different, elements here. I am struck by the fact that there's so many things that we don't talk about. And I think that sort of reflects the reality, I think you'll agree with this, that I observed in government, which is it's hard for any administration to do more than one and a half things at a time, big things. And right now, obviously, they're very, very preoccupied with Ukraine. They're very, very preoccupied for good reason with the war in Gaza and the prospect that it can spread and become a bigger war, as we've discussed on multiple episodes. But I also think it has a pathology, which is, before we came on, you and I were talking about the Lawrence Norman article in the Wall Street Journal, and similar articles in the Daily Telegraph about the administration actually being kind of concerned that the Europeans are leaning too forward in wanting to condemn the Iranians for increasing by some 20 kilos their enriched uranium at 60%, which the IAEA has reported. And I think that's out of a misguided sense that we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to, get into a bigger dust up with, Iran. But what it really testifies to is something we've talked about in the past, the lack of an Iran. They don't have an Iran policy. Their Iran policy was engagement in order to try and get a longer, stronger agreement on the nuclear program. That failed because the Iranians were essentially unwilling to take yes for an answer. And they've just defaulted to having no policy.
Well, and I think there's also how to put it, sort of a deep inclination towards the status quo. And I use the term timidity, which maybe is too harsh. Um, um, it's this desire for equilibrium, for stability, as you say, don't rock the boat. And we've discussed this before. I think a lot of those instincts are very deeply ingrained from the Cold War, particularly in the case of somebody like Joe Biden. And they get communicated to the staff who are, also educated at places where that's what they would have heard. So the default position is stability, incremental change at most. Don't disturb things. But if, as I believe, and I think you may believe, we're entering a really perilous period, that's not good enough. I mean, FDR did not have a "don't rock the boat" policy, and I'm not saying we're facing World War III, but it's just not the right mindset. As long as I'm on that kick, let me throw something at you. I think I may have mentioned this earlier. I'm not sure. I really now push back when people use the term the rules-based international order. I think that fundamentally misunderstands the issues that are at stake and the things we have to be concerned about. What happened was that in 1945, actually starting in 43, 44, there began to be an American-led international order, which did not cover the whole globe, not by a long shot. But it was underpinned by American strength and American alliances and institutions that the United States created. And that order is unquestionably in jeopardy. And it is it's being eroded in a number of ways. Just one small issue, which we've discussed. So, right now, the Houthis haven't sunk any ships recently. But, there's a big piece in the Financial Times about how nobody's sailing through the Red Sea anymore. So instead, they're routing traffic around Africa. Well, the United States has been the world's dominant maritime power. And what the dominant maritime power does, and the British did, we do, is you guarantee the freedom of the seas. And once you've lost that, then you've really lost something major. And I just think there are pieces of this world order which are coming unglued, and we will really regret the day when they become so decisively unglued that everybody, not just, foreign policy geeks like us, looks around and say, yeah, I guess the world has come unglued.
Yeah, well, and our colleague at SICE, Hal Brands, actually has a bit of a excursus on this in Foreign Affairs about what an America first. He's actually looking at what happens if Trump wins in November and we have an America first foreign policy, and what will the consequences be for global order. And it's pretty much along the lines you were just suggesting. Look, I've one of the things that I find perplexing about the Biden administration is that, as you were saying, they're raising concerns about the global order. They're raising concerns about the future of democracy and the fate of democracy versus authoritarianism, globally, both at home and globally. And yet they seem to be obsessed politically with no thunder on the left, as if that's the big challenge. When the left of their party and the left on campus, and I know you want to get to the issues of what's going on campuses. It's small, tiny, vocal minority that is doesn't really represent that much. I mean, you see that in primary results, for instance, in Democratic primaries. The moderates are winning, so-called progressives are losing, and yet, in this sort of what should be national emergency, all hands on deck, and with a president who likes to compare himself to FDR, with which there are some, in terms of legislative accomplishments, there's some, some basis for that. And I tend to agree with you about the industrial policy pieces that Biden has put in place, particularly with regard to competition with China. And that's been bipartisan. But, in 1940, FDR put Henry Stimson and Frank Knox into his cabinet as Secretary of War and Secretary of the Navy. You don't see much of that, and you don't see much outreach. They say, they put up a couple of ads saying, "We want you, Nikki Haley voters." But, you and I were discussing in a private session, I'm not going to go into the details, but with an administration official that you sponsored, where a group of us got together, and I made the point, there's been almost zero outreach to people who are potentially their allies, at least in the election, for the purposes of the election. But they don't seem capable of thinking about it in those terms.
So my theory of this, and I don't know if this will take us to the universities or not, is this has less to do with Biden, whose, I think, instinct as a former senator is to cut deals. And even though the, sort of the working class shtick is a shtick, I mean, given that his real background was sort of solidly upper middle class, still, I mean, he could function in that world. The problem is the governing class that you have now. In other words, the sort of the administrative state that you get tend to be people like the people you and I know well, who are graduates of elite institutions with degrees in law, uh, chiefly, sometimes some other things, who would have absolutely no idea how to deal with construction workers or the pipe fitters or, in some ways, normal Americans altogether, whose worldview probably shaped, I mean, let's say very much in accord with Barack Obama, don't do stupid things, but also no enemies on the left, really. And I think they are a product of elite university culture, which has been kind of rotting for a long time. I mean, that's a strong word, but that's my personal view. And they are kind of gauchiste. They are not inclined to have anything to do with people who really disagree with them. They do tend to be sort of self-righteous and not particularly skeptical. And I think when you have a mass that's like that, which is pretty homogeneous, I mean, they may be diverse by skin color, but I think by outlook and by life experience, they're actually very homogeneous. I mean, you're not getting a whole lot of people who are really kind of working class through and through. You may have people who've kind of broken into that gilded set. But the result is, I think that you can't underestimate the impact of having a governing class that's not particularly visible most of the time, but actually any administration depends on to get the job done. And the politicians may be different. I mean, just point to somebody like John Fetterman, who I'm now actually very well disposed to. I think that guy actually does know how to talk to people in the pipe fitters union. And he does have some sort of visceral sense of, okay, this is what Americans in the center of the country are like. And I think a lot of these people would have no idea how to deal with any of them.
I would just add one element to that, which this is, and we've talked about this in the past. This is a particularly insular group in the sense that so many of them, are essentially creatures. I'm sorry, of the of sort of the Biden world. They've been staffers for Biden, during his time as a member of the Senate, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then as vice president. And so there's a particular kind of insularity here, I think, which is particularly disabling given this, kind of range of challenges they're facing and the need for coalition building. I think that they are not, recognizing sufficiently.
I think, and again, I'll just say I think some of this is really quite deeply rooted in where, what elite culture is now producing. I mean, I don't know how many conversations I've had with students who's, you ask them what they want to do. They say, okay, they say, I want to make policy. To which my response is always, okay, what policy would you like to make? And you get a blank stare. They know they want to make policy. And that's not good enough. I maybe towards the end we should come back to the university world, because I'm increasingly convinced that's where actually a large part of the problem originates. Both you and I have spent a lot of time there.
Well, let's go there now.
You want to go there now? Okay.
Yeah, sure. No time.
All right, man. Let's go there. Okay, so let me. Could I begin by throwing a question at you? You have a couple of years on me. In '68, I was still in junior high.
You know how to hurt a guy.
Yeah, I do. But you were at Cornell, in the bad old days, and you saw what it was like when the campuses went up in flames. I don't think the campuses are up in flames at all now. I think you're seeing some very, very noisy demonstrations at largely elite institutions. There was actually Washington Monthly, of all places, did a very elaborate statistical survey, which says,
I saw that
the Israel-Gaza demonstrations are predominantly at these expensive elite institutions.
Yeah.
But in any case, I'd be interested in some comparative, end of civilization, barbarians at the gates.
It's a tired trope, but I think it was in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon that Karl Marx wrote that, all history occurs twice. The first time as tragedy and the second time as farce. And as someone who, unlike you, began his sort of adult political life on the left as a, SDS fellow traveler, my first several years at Cornell. I'm kind of inclined to see it, that way. The big difference between the sort of paroxysms that seized American universities in the late 60s, Columbia in the spring of 68, and then Cornell in the spring of 69, Harvard as well. And then in 1970, obviously big demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. I mean, that was a war in which the United States was directly involved, in which until 1970, there was a draft that was conscripting, students to go fight. Now, for a long period of the Vietnam War, there were student deferments, you know, which kept college students out of the draft. Um, but those started to go away. They actually, you know, ended the student deferment and went to a lottery system for the draft. I remember being in, I think maybe not the first year. I might have been in the second year of the lottery before the draft was abolished by Nixon and Ford, um, in which you know, I happen to draw a very high lottery number. But my point is that this was something that, you know, weighed heavily on people for, you know, really good reasons. Now, I mean, you know, a lot of the, in retrospect, I think a lot of the argumentation about of the anti-war movement was really wrong and wrong-headed about the conflict in Southeast Asia. Um, although I will, in my, you know, in my own defense, self-defense, you know, for stupid things I used to believe, I do think it's fair to say that certainly the war that was prosecuted by William Westmoreland might have been the dumbest war the United States has ever, you know, tried to fight. I mean, it was so poorly prosecuted. I think after Creighton Abrams came over, it was a lot different, but that's a kind of detail. But my point was, this was something that the U.S. was directly involved in. Students had a direct, real interest in. Um, and there was a potential that their political action could lead to changes, and did lead to changes in U.S. government policy. What you see today is, you know, something that's, you know, at one remove, where the U.S. government is got limited ability to actually affect the conflict, and where I mean, again, a lot of the things I think I believed in 1969 and 1970 about Vietnam, in retrospect, turn out to be wrong. But there also was a lot of serious study going on of the war. I mean, it led to a big boom in Asian studies in the United States as people tried to actually study and understand, you know, these societies in Southeast Asia, and to some degree the you know, People's Republic of China. It was the beginning of the opening to China as a result of Nixon and Kissinger's diplomacy. You know, what you see now is just a lot of ignorance and bias being paraded by students, and I just get you know, a sense of the decline of serious study, and particularly the decline of the study of history, which is, I think, going to be catastrophic for the country in the future, because um, you know, people who don't know their past are incapable of understanding, you know, the present that they're involved in.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. Maybe a somewhat different angle in all this. It seems to me that the outbursts of the late '60s, one, you know, they're very draft driven, and I think a lot of people have commented that once the draft goes away, then all of a
Yeah,
sudden, you know, there's just not a whole lot of oomph in
it's true. Although the draft goes away also in a period of time when the war is going away,
yeah, exactly.
because of Vietnamization, and because of the, you know, peace agreement of 1973. So
But I think that there's more to it than that. First, it's, you know, part of the great youth revolution, which actually, of course, swept away institutions pretty far afield, including France. You know,
yes,
Charles de Gaulle
yeah, it's a
is
global phenomenon.
and some of that is pure demographics. That you had this bulge of young people in the late '60s because of the demographic boom immediately after World War II. It's also the overthrow of all kinds of traditional mores in terms of sexual mores, but also the idea of a university of being in loco parentis. And of course, it got a kind of high moral fuel from the civil rights movement. So I think you had a number of things that came together in all that, which helped produce it. And of course, in retrospect, it got romanticized. I mean, I think the place where they're really paying the penalty for that is Colombia, where I hadn't realized the extent to which the administration, as a way of luring students to Columbia, celebrated, insurrection on their own campus. But I think as I've reflected on this, because I went to Harvard as a freshman in 1973, when things had settled down, is, okay, the faculty who were around in 68, 69 may have been really unhappy with what was going on, but they didn't leave. They were still around. There were some of your teachers, some of my teachers, and they were kind of a conservative ballast in a way in these institutions. It didn't really affect. It had some effects on curriculum. I mean, I remember there was introductory economics course. There was a Marxist economics section, which would be sort of like having a section on voodoo at a medical school. Um, but the thing is, it took a while, I think, for the full effects to be felt, to include, what the left sometimes refers to as the long march through the institutions. And, so the result is the composition of the faculty is very different. The composition of the faculty was not changed at all, I think, by the revolutions of 68, 69. But it has changed now in terms of not just political outlook, where conservatives are really a small minority. I mean, they were kind of a minority when I was in college, but, not an endangered one. Whereas now they most definitely are, but also the corruption of the disciplines had not really fully taken hold, in part because, you had those older faculty, and a lot of them were not conservatives. They were really, I mean, my old mentor, Sam Huntington, was sometimes called a conservative. He said, I'm a liberal, and he was. He was an old-fashioned liberal. So what happened, I think, as a result, is actually we're now, even though there's less kind of overt upheaval and destruction, and when you look at it, most of these demonstrations actually have petered out, although I think they will come back. The lasting damage that's been done is, I think, now just beginning to manifest itself. The one last thing I'll say is, I think this is going to accelerate a change in how we think about higher education. I think the expense that there will continue to be universities, including my own, Johns Hopkins, which are extraordinarily wealthy and can get away with a lot. Of course, Harvard is in a class by itself, but Stanford, Yale, not far behind. But increasingly, I think what's going to happen is you see a lot of kids turn to the STEM, the scientific and technical things, and the social sciences and humanities are shrinking, with a few exceptions like economics, I suppose. And you'll have a kind of a radicalized minority and a sort of a vaguely right-thinking majority, but not another minority, which is sort of right-thinking. And then the majority of kids just want to be left alone and, get a degree and go get a job. But I also think what may very well happen is that you're going to see the institutions that produce the country's leaders no longer being the Ivies. And in that respect, very different from the world of Walter Lippmann.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Just to kind of maybe tie this subject off a bit, one of the things that was most shocking to me in 1969, after the Willard Straight Hall student union at Cornell was taken over by gun-toting student radicals acting on behalf of the Black Student Union at Cornell, was the reaction of a lot of the left faculty. Now, I mean, there were some very famous conservatives like Alan Bloom, who left Cornell, resigned from Cornell, went to the University of Toronto and then to Chicago, and others. But Walter Lefebvre, who was my teacher and very much a figure on the left, threatened. I mean, he resigned as chairman of the history department and threatened to leave the university. In the end, he didn't. I was very lucky about that. But there was, as you say, there was a lot of ballast in the faculty. What I think has happened at least, I mean, I can't speak for other disciplines, but I can speak a bit for history. I think is by the time I, ended up as a graduate student in the history department in Yale in 1972, what had happened was that a lot of the students on the left had begun to agitate against what they, regarded as the hegemony of traditional disciplines in history, diplomatic history, military history, political history, and demanding a kind of history from the bottom up, that history needed to be not just the history of elites, but the history of the masses and those who, the inarticulate peasants and workers who were the real motive. I mean, there was a lot of, proto-Marxism, quasi-Marxism, and all of this, or Marx adjacent thinking that the motive force of history was really these subaltern classes that had not gotten their due, and so we needed to have social history and cultural history and gendered history and history of minorities. And look, some of that was a very useful corrective to the more traditional focus of American, I mean, and particularly in American history. I mean, there was a lot of very good work that was done, on slavery and on slaves, their contributions to America's economic development, Black freedmen, their role as well. So, I mean, there was a lot that was useful and a corrective. But I also think it came to just be the dominant mode of historical inquiry at the university. And the more traditional disciplines, political history, military history, diplomatic history, were crowded out almost to the point of extinction. And along with that came a focus on not narrative, but on sort of history as the history of problems, the problem of race in America, the problem of empire in America, the problem of the woman's question in America. And I think what was lost was a sense of the story of the country, for warts and all. And the human mind craves a narrative, and students have been enormously turned off. And so the irony you have is you get a lot of popular historians, like David McCullough, for instance, just picking one at random, who write best-selling books because Americans really crave, or Stephen Ambrose, who was an academic historian but wrote extraordinarily well, maybe wrote too much. But the academy's been left far behind, and it's why you've had this catastrophic decline in enrollments, because we're teaching courses that in history that students just aren't interested in taking.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's also, I mean, just to extend and revise your remarks, in certain fields, it is impossible to have a non-ideological discussion, say, of the British Empire. I mean, this is a huge battle that goes on now in the UK. Um, and, it's possible to study the British Empire being fully cognizant of the really ugly sides of it while also being interested in some of the parts that aren't so ugly and that are, had lasting consequences. Since we're talking about history, could I shift us a bit and talk about Russian history? Because, you, of course, you were stationed in Russia for a number of years. You've read widely in Russian history. And I just I'll put on the table, I'm reading a book now, which was recommended by a good friend who's very, very knowledgeable about today's Russia. As he said, he thought it was one of the best books he had read, by Tibor Samueli, who has an interesting history, which you can discuss. It's called The Russian Tradition. It was edited posthumously. He died quite young, I think at 47, by Robert Conquest, the famous, deservedly famous chronicler of the purges and of the Great Terror and of the Holodomor. And I'll just kind of I'll open with a statement, then a question. The statement is, it really does remind me a lot of the coursework that I did with Richard Pipes, great historian of the Russian Revolution and Russia under the old regime, probably his best book, um, or most famous book, about the extent to which, Russia, even today, and he was writing in like 57 or so, is very much in the grip of its past and of the past of an autocratic system in which basically nobody has any rights. And, he's very interested in the way in which, the Russians have nobility, but actually it's not like the European, West European nobility, which is a separate estate. It's a service nobility. And anything you have can be taken away by the autocrat. Um, and it's a reminder to me of, what you can get from a pretty deep reading of history. So the question, though, that I would pose to you is, first, if you want to comment on the book or the character, that would be great. But I think the practical question that it raises is, if this is what Russia is like, what prospect is there that you'll ever get a better Russia? Or do you just basically have to say, look, this is the Russia we're going to be stuck with forever, and we just need to make our arrangements understanding that?
A lot to unpack there. Big questions. Let me start with the last question first, which is um, I think one has to be a little careful about essentialism, right? That there's some kind of unchanging nature, that people have. Obviously, at the end of World War II, one could have said of the Germans and the Japanese, that these are deeply seated authoritarian cultures that are incapable of democracy, and that proved to be untrue. Now, of course, it proved to be untrue in the aftermath of a devastating war that totally destroyed the social basis of those regimes and allowed the United States, essentially, with some help from its allies, to essentially literally reconstruct those societies from top to bottom, including school curricula and stuff like that. Having said that, I think there is such a thing as national character, and I think there's such a thing as strategic culture that is deeply embedded. We are products of our past. It's impossible for people to not be. I'm reminded of a story. My great uncle was the chairman of the sociology department at the University of Nice, and as when you defend your doctoral thesis in France, your thèse de troisième état, you end up doing it in public in an amphitheater usually, and it's a lot of people attending. So he had a student who was her whole thesis was about the idea that there is no such thing as national character. It's purely an artificial construct, a very deconstructionist, view of national character. So in the oral exam, he asked her he said, I only have one question. He said, can you tell me what the difference is between une soupière and a pot de chambre, between a soup tureen and a chamber pot? And she looked at him quizzically and said, no. She said, I don't know the difference. And he said, well, in that case, I'm never coming to your home for dinner. and I so there is such a thing as national character, but I think we have to be careful about being too deterministic about it. I've not read Samuel's book, but I have read Russia Under the Old Regime, which I do believe is one of the great books on Russian history. When I went to serve in Moscow, actually, Tom Simons, who had a PhD in Russian history from Harvard, distinguished foreign service officer who was ambassador to Poland. He was the country director when I was getting ready to go out to Moscow. And when I asked him, okay, what should I read before I go out? He basically said, he gave me two books to read. He said, one is James Billington's The Icon and the Axe, which is an interpretation of Russian culture. And the other was, Russia Under the Old Regime by Pipes. And, I think Pipes is really very perceptive about how, I mean, he starts obviously with discussion of Russian geography and how Russia's geography left it with no sort of natural boundaries, and subject to attack from multiple directions, which left Russian people and leaders with a pervasive sense of insecurity, compounded by some of the agricultural problems that that the land that they were living on dictated because of the harsh winters and whatnot. And he describes the development of a situation that he describes as a system of what he describes as patrimonialism, where without, sort of the kind of land tenure systems that emerged in Britain and in Western Europe, and primogeniture and things like that, you ended up with a system in which people did not have any inherent rights. Everything was a grant from the ruler, an act of lèse majesté by ultimately the czar. And that has persisted. It persisted ultimately throughout. I mean, that was Pipes' whole point. This persisted throughout the Soviet period, and it is clearly, I think, persisted into the post-Soviet period under Putin. I mean, and what Putin presides over is a patrimonial system where nobody has any property rights and everything is a grant from the czar, who has to very carefully hand things out to keep factions of boyars from overthrowing him. And that's what we're dealing with. The question of, is that all we're dealing with? Look, I remember when I was in the Pentagon when the Soviet Union collapsed and worked on issues of Russia, for the immediate period afterwards, and served as ambassador to Finland in the late 90s as, Russia was going through the post-Soviet turmoil. And the one thing I think that Russians would tell you is we're really tired of, kind of being, this isolated empire that's really alienated from Europe because we never had a Renaissance, we never had a Reformation. We want to become a normal country. And Putin, for his own reasons, basically chose not to go down that route, but rather to play to the sense of insecurity and nationalism in order to bolster his own regime. Now, I don't think that means that it's impossible it could have, a more democratic regime, but you're going to have, this regime will have to collapse and go away before you can get that. And I'm not sure how long that will take, and whether you could have a, Putinism without Putin if someone comes to power who turns out to be as adept as he has been at managing factionalism, which has been his greatest accomplishment, in my view.
So, a couple of thoughts. One is, that's a wonderful summary. It's very interesting to me how easily we misread the situation because of an ignorance of history. So, I agree with you. Today's Russia is a patrimonial state, which is why the idea that by slapping sanctions on oligarchs, you're going to affect anything in Russia is ridiculous, because the Putin view of those oligarchs is their money belongs to him. He's letting them park it for now or use it for now. But the idea that they have any kind of, independent right to it is just absurd. Second thing, though, I think, and this is why I've grown to have it's an even darker view of Russia than of China, actually. First, the history of autocracy is so long and so deep. It goes back to, basically when the Duchy of Muscovy they were the tax collectors for the Mongols, and And that's why they're not descended from Kievan Rus. It's something quite different. And and it's different from Germany or Japan. Germany was in the center of European culture. It did have the Reformation. It did have lots of other things that were going on at the same time. Japan, of course, is a very unique case because of its isolation. But with Russia, the reflexes they're so deep. So even the issues of the role of the church. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church has always been, always, for centuries and centuries, an arm of the Russian state. And it's I think one of the things that surprised me, and I think it surprised a lot of people, is I had incorrectly thought that, well, once the Russians begin taking serious casualties, it'll be like Afghanistan, where once they had taken like about 15,000 dead and many more wounded, that there would be internal dissent that would get in the way. Well, they've now had over 500,000 casualties, and there is no visible, I would say, visible, significant internal dissent. You look at the extent to which people are willing to go along with the propaganda, and this sort of very old tropes of alienation, not only alienation from Europe, but kind of contempt for the values of the West. Yeah, I mean, you could go on and on, and
This
I
is
mean,
though, but Eliot, this is the triumph of pan-Slavism over Westernizing,
yeah,
tendencies in Russia. Again, I mean, the history is absolutely
right. And now
important
the
here.
thing is that there've always been the Westernizers, but what's striking is they almost always end up in prison, in exile, or
Yeah,
dead.
yeah, yeah.
So
I mean, this is a larger conversation, but I mean, one of the things that happened after the end of the Cold War is the whole cadre of Russia experts in the Foreign Service, for instance, and in the Department of Defense, and you had them kind of aged out, retired, and were never replaced because Russia wasn't important anymore. People stopped studying Russian, stopped studying Russian history. I mean, and our friend Toria Newland, who has been quite outspoken of late, now that she's retired from government service, was kind of the last of that group of folks. And now we're going to have to rebuild that cadre in order to, I think, to get around some of the policy deficiencies that you mentioned. We've got about 5 minutes, and I know you've got
yeah,
a tight deadline. I do want to make sure we get though to the article you have in Foreign Affairs about a theory of victory for Ukraine, which is not unrelated to what we've been talking about, because I think people really are craving some idea of how does this end, to take David Petraeus's famous question to Linda Robinson, tell me
yeah,
how this ends, and you've got a modest proposal, to coin a phrase on that. Could you tell our viewers and listeners about what's in that, and then let's talk, if we can, about the increasing isolation of the Biden administration in its insistence on imposing limits on Ukrainian strikes inside
yeah.
Russia.
So I wrote the article together with Andriy Zagorodnyuk, who's a former Ukrainian defense minister. He's an industrialist. He really likes heavy industry. That was his background. And he was a very good reforming minister of defense. And Andrew's the lead author. I mean, so this is a Ukrainian idea. So basically, the first thing is just positing you need a theory of victory. It's not enough for the West to say, we're in it for as long as it takes, and for the Ukrainians simply to be aspirational. We've got to restore our borders, get everybody back, punish the evildoers. And it's not. I think I mean, a lot of the measures will be very familiar to people. Obviously, lifting those restrictions. I mean, it's painful to watch as Kharkiv gets battered by systems that are on Russian territory, and why on earth we should refuse to allow Western systems to strike back is absurd. We try to point out that there are things that are going better for the Ukrainians that people have been really focused on. The main thing, of course, is the Black Sea, where they've like wiped out a third of the Black Sea fleet. But more importantly, their grain exports are at the same level that they used to be before the war, which is extraordinary, and tells you something about what they can do with high tech. I think the main distinguishing feature of the article is to say, look, there needs to be an industrial strategy that supports a strategic concept whose basic idea is not another, attempt to achieve something like a breakout from the Normandy Peninsula, but rather a very sustained deep fires campaign, which will eventually require movement on the ground to really destroy Russian logistical infrastructure in occupied Ukraine, but also to some extent in Russia itself. And the Ukrainians have clearly made a very good start of this. And we've seen what they've been able to do. For example, in Crimea, they've really been tearing down the Russian air defense system, attacking air bases, and so forth. But I think one of the key parts of the proposal is that it's of vital importance that we really strengthen and enable the Ukrainian defense industrial system, because which has been able. I mean, they are producing tens of thousands of drones. They have very clever people who, of course, have a lot of very direct experience, which we do not have, of dealing with Russian systems. They've been able to build systems to attack deep into Russia. Russia's vastness is a weakness as well as a strength. It's a weakness because they simply cannot cover everything. And I think our feeling is you can take down a lot of the logistical infrastructure that supports the war, including the Kerch Bridge, but also this parallel rail line. But you can also really go after Russian oil production, which is vital for the regime. I mean, if they don't, the way that they're able to keep economically afloat is that. So, I mean, a lot of the other elements would be familiar to people, getting your hands on Russian assets. But I think the main point that we're trying to make is if you really empower the Ukrainians, in particular, really help them build up a defense industry that can match some Russian production, which we believe you can, um, that you can put the Russians in a position where they no longer think they're going to win. And I think that's the key thing. It's you're not going to drive on Moscow. You're probably not going to simply, launch an attack like the counteroffensive of last year, which was, I think, ill-advised, where you're somehow going to have armored spearheads rolling down to the Black Sea. This is going to have to be different, heavily reliant on fires, but above all, heavily reliant on an industrial base that can support it. By the way, some of those factories and so on don't necessarily have to be in Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean, they also need to, I think, get on top of their military manpower problem as well, which is, I think, an issue for them that they have to do. But all of this, I mean, just to close out, because I know you need to get on the move, requires, I guess, two things. One, that Donald Trump not be elected in November, because obviously that would change the equation dramatically to the disfavor of Ukraine, but also that the administration, and also not just the Biden administration, but also the Chancellor Schultz and the German government lift these absurd restrictions, that allow Russia to have a sanctuary from which to just pummel, Ukraine as they are in Kharkiv. I mean, I again, I'm just struck by there's a lot of revulsion against the things people are seeing coming out of the airstrike on Rafah for understandable reasons. But the same thing is going on in Kharkiv, and yet nobody seems to bat an eye.
Well, it's and much worse because the Russians are targeting civilians. The Israelis, I think, are not targeting civilians. Bad stuff happens when you fight a war in the middle of an urban area. But the Russians are now
right.
They're targeting power generation, and they're targeting civilian targets because they want to depopulate Kharkiv. Look, the thing is, you have to want to win, and you have to want Ukraine to win, and that's the big hurdle that the administration hasn't gotten over. One of the things that I found very disheartening was a friend showed me this all public information because the visitors' logs are public at the White House. One of the most frequent visitors to the White House is a guy named Samuel Charp from the Rand Corporation, who has been one of the biggest, shall I say, defeatists on this question for a very long time.
Yeah.
So in a way, it goes back to where we started. I mean, they are not willing to listen. Whereas I bet you, we could ask our friends Fred and Kim Kagan whether they've been invited to the White House.
I unfortunately know the answer to that question.
So do I. So do I. And it's not a heartening one.
Right.
And, until they're willing to change their mindset, it's going to be a drip, drip, drip. And it's, one of the things that troubles me is, when you go to Ukraine, as I've been, you can see that although they appreciate the support they've gotten thus far, they don't yet feel that they're getting the kind of support they would get if we really wanted them to win. So,
well, that'll have to do it for this episode of Shield of the Republic. But as we pass the century mark here with 100+ episodes, I'm looking forward to the next 100, Eliot.
Yeah, well, I am too. Another century of probably increasing grumpiness, I've got a feeling, Eric.